Hi, I'm Eliane from Patchwork and Poodles, and today we are going to hand quilt orange peels. I really love this design. It adds such an amazing texture and element to the quilt that you can't really get any other way. How do you hand quilt orange peels? We're going to do it all today, including creating a template for your quilt. The quilt behind me was hand quilted with an orange peel design, and it's absolutely my favorite quilt I own. The first thing that we need to do to stitch our orange peels is that we have to make ourselves a template. So the first thing to make our template is decide on the size of your orange peels. I went around my house and I found this Pyrex lid that's a 5-inch diameter, and I thought this looked like about the right size for the project that I was making. You can definitely make your circle bigger or smaller. Definitely look at the size of your quilt, the motifs on your quilt. That helps you to determine how big or how small you can get away with when stitching your orange peels. Although this looks like a big circle, I went ahead and I traced it onto a piece of paper first. So before I make my template out of plastic, I decided I was going to see what it would really look like using paper. So I traced 2 circles. One of them's here. The other one I cut out. With the circle that I cut out, I folded it in half and then in half again so that I got 1/4 of my circle. This allowed me to make some marks and to identify the 4 points around my circle, and then I went ahead and I traced it out to see what those peels would look like. I like the size of these peels. I think it's going to look really nice on my project, so I decided this was the right size lid. We're going to go ahead and make our template with this. To make my template, I like to buy these chopping mats at the Dollar Tree. It's $1 for 2 of them. It's this nice rigid plastic that's a really good template material because it doesn't seem to crack or break really easily, but it's easy to cut with scissors. So go ahead and get yourself some of these. If you don't have any, you could use some cardboard, maybe even an old cereal box to make your template. That way you can use it for the rest of your quilt. So with that chopping mat, I went ahead and I cut out a circle. And then once I had my circle, I used a Sharpie and this piece of paper that I had before, and I marked the fourths. I cut my circle into fourths and I marked it with a Sharpie line. This is going to be important when we're going to be marking our quilt later on, so make sure not to skip this step. You definitely want to see what those 4 points look like. Okay, so we have our template. Now we need our project. This is my project. I'm going to be stitching this pillow cover. The first thing that I did is I marked a grid on here. So there's 2 things. One is you'll notice that there's a line all the way across that's 1/2 inch from the edge. So if you remember in Hand Quilting 101, I don't stitch all the way to the edge. I always leave a 1/2 inch all the way around. So I went ahead and I drew those lines for myself here, so I knew not to put my template and trace it onto the edge. To mark your grid, you're going to want to make the vertical lines the same width as the diameter of your circle. I have a 5-inch diameter circle, so my lines vertically are 5 inch apart. My lines horizontally going up the side of my quilt are 2.5 inches apart, so they are half of the diameter of my circle. If I was using a 6-inch circle, then my vertical lines would be 6 inches apart and my horizontal lines would be 3 inches apart. So you're making a rectangular grid. Vertical lines are the diameter of your circle, and the horizontal lines are half the diameter of your circle. So with that done, I'm ready to start marking my quilt with my template. I'm using a chalk pencil today, and what I'm going to do is I want my circle to fit right in the center of that grid that I've marked. So my grid is the same size as my circle template. It'll be really easy for me to line it up in there. The other thing that I do is I make sure those Sharpie lines match up with that horizontal line right in the center. Since our horizontal grid is half the diameter, and these points intersect half of our circle, it should line up really nicely. So I'm going to go ahead and mark my whole first row. So here's my first row. You'll notice that there's some spots like right here where they don't quite line up, and that's okay because when I'm stitching, I'm going to go ahead and just make sure that I bring my stitches right up to the edge here. My template seems to be a tiny bit smaller than my lines, but it's a good guide to keep that circle nice and even. So you can go ahead, your lines are not the definitive answer to your stitching. They're a good guide. So go ahead and don't worry if they don't line up perfectly. When you're stitching, you can go ahead and rectify that. When I'm stitching orange peels, I like to go ahead and mark several rows at a time, and then I go back and I stitch all those rows, and then I continue on my quilt. So it's a little bit tedious to mark these, so I'd rather mark some rows, have fun stitching them, come back and mark some more. But you can go ahead and mark your whole quilt too. This is a smaller project. I might go ahead and mark the whole thing and then go ahead and stitch the whole thing. Two rows. I'm going to go ahead and start stitching these down. You'll notice that they don't look like orange peels yet, they just look like circles. We're going to get to the other half of our orange peels in a little bit. The first thing that I do is I like to stitch my circles, and then I come back in and I stitch the alternating circles that turn into the orange peels. To stitch these, I end up doing one row at a time. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start here. I'm going to go up and down, and then down here and back up in a sort of snaking motion. Once I reach this point, it's a good spot to just loop yourself around and finish off the circles. This allows me to stitch an entire row at once without having to worry about stopping or starting or ending up in a weird spot. So we're going to do a snaking motion all the way to the end, loop around, and come back. So I've stitched one half, so I'm going to go ahead and stitch the other half. You'll notice as I'm stitching, I'm not quite following those lines that I drew. They're my guide. So if I feel like I want to go straight up to this line here because I want them to touch, I want this circle to touch this circle when they're done, I'm going to go ahead and just arc myself up a little bit off of that line so that those circles are really drawn for your guide. Again, you don't have to follow them exactly if you feel like you could get a slightly better shape. And don't worry too much about your arcs being perfectly round and circular. It all looks really good in the end. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go ahead and do the other half, and then I'm going to go ahead and do these circles up here. I stitch all the circles first, and then I go back in and do the other intersecting circles afterwards. One more thing to note is that if you're new to hand quilting, make sure to check out my Hand Quilting 101 video. I cover supplies, and then I cover how-to for basic stitches, burying the threads, traveling, all of those things. So I'm assuming in this video that you know how to hand stitch. If you don't, go ahead and watch that video first. It's going to really help you in this one as well. If you run out of thread at some point, no matter where you are, go ahead and make a knot and bury your thread, and then just start with a new piece of thread. When I reach the end of a row, I personally don't travel to the next row. I find it's a little bit easier because that space is so far away. For me, it's a little bit easier just to tie a knot, bury my thread, and start with a fresh piece of thread at the next row. Once all of my circles are stitched all the way across, it's time to put in our intersecting circles to make our orange peels. So we're going to grab our template one more time. And just like last time, we're going to use the marks that intersect the middle of our circle to line up with the horizontal lines on our grid. But this time we're also going to use the two vertical marks and line them up with the vertical lines on our grid. So these two line up here, these two line up here. We're going to go ahead and trace that. You'll notice that we don't have anything on the ends. So for the ends, you want to do the same thing, lining up the intersecting line in the middle on the horizontal line, and then your vertical lines are going to line up with the end of your grid. So for the sides, you're only going to be marking half the circle, and we're going to do the same thing down here. Again, it's going to be half our circle. Vertical line is going to match up with the vertical line. The horizontal lines are going to match up with the bottom of our grid. To stitch these new circles, we're going to do the same thing that we did for the first circles. We're going to start at one spot, go down, snake it around, up, and snake. This time though, because this circle doesn't connect, we're going to tie off our knots, and we're going to start again down here, going up and down, up and down. For this down here, which is only half a circle, it's going to be sewn like a clamshell would be. So we're going to start here, we're going to go down, up and down, to the end. Once all of these are stitched, it's really fun to see because your orange peel design really starts to come through, which is really, really fun. So this is how to hand stitch orange peels. Be sure to subscribe, and if you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. If there's anything that you want to see me stitch next, let me know that in the comments as well. And again, check out my YouTube channel for more hand quilting tutorials, as well as other quilting tutorials and how-tos. Thanks for watching.